First of all, welcome to everybody who's joining us online. Welcome to this policy talk. My name is Warren Mabey. I'm the director of the School of Policy Studies here at Queen's University. And I'm delighted to have you here and delighted to be able to welcome you into our virtual policy talk series. Before we get underway, I just want to acknowledge that I'm currently sitting here at Queen's University on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe peoples. And because we are virtual, you may be sitting on a variety of different traditional territories and unceded territories. And I would like everybody just to take a moment to think about that and to acknowledge the privilege that we have in being able to meet here, to study here, to work here, to play here. It is a real privilege, as I say, to have that. Our talk today is focused on poverty, pandemic, and the social determinants of health, a basic income bridge to the future. And I am thrilled to be able to welcome our three speakers. Brief introductions for our speakers. So first of all, many of you will recognize Hugh Segal, former senator, former director of the Massey College at the University of Toronto, and current senior fellow within the School of Policy Studies, and the current chair of our external advisory board. So Mr. Segal, thank you so much for joining us. We have Rebecca Wissink, who is an MA student in cultural studies. Cultural studies is another of our programs here at Queen's University, and we're delighted that Rebecca is able to be here with us. Rebecca took part in a couple of our working groups over the summer, and I'm going to talk about those in just a moment. And finally, Juliana Rohr. Juliana not only worked with us throughout the summer, but really helped shepherd a lot of work within our working group on economics. And so we really want to thank Juliana and thank her for being here today. Juliana is currently undertaking her JD degree up at the University of Ottawa. So thank you to the three of you for being here. The work that they're presenting today really reports back on the activities of a working group that the School of Policy Studies organized in the summer of 2020. As the pandemic began and as our various institutions scrambled to respond, one of the things that the School of Policy Studies did was we organized a series of working groups looking at different areas and how we might respond to this pandemic and how we might build back better. The work that we're talking about here reports back on some of that activity. And so I'm delighted to be able to welcome our speakers. Rather than taking more time, I think I'd like to now hand over to Hugh. And Hugh, you can introduce the rest of the talk. Thank you.
Warren, thanks very much. The paper we're going to review is a summary that of a piece of work on income security reform that Juliana Orlando Rohr and Rebecca Wissink and myself worked on, along with Rafayette Nawaz, which was part of the income security section of the Economic Recovery Working Group's paper on getting society back to work, all of which is now available on the school's website. Juliana will take us through the relevant income security background in Canada and the central case for basic income, and review some of the key terminology that's relevant to the discussion. Rebecca will concentrate on the issues exposed by the COVID-19 virus, its impact economically on people's lives and on those who are most vulnerable in Canadian society. And then I will address what we've learned from the pandemic in terms of how that shapes us, helps us shape a clear plan for implementation of a basic income as a key part of inclusive economic recovery. So I'm going to ask Juliana to take us from there. Juliana?
Thank you, Hugh, for the introduction. So before we start talking about basic income, it's important to take a look at how COVID-19 impacted income security in Canada. As we all know, when the pandemic hit Canada, provinces went on lockdown, which created economic insecurities on multiple levels. Many people lost their jobs, Many small businesses went bankrupt and household debt increased significantly. But even though Statistics Canada shows that almost 40% of jobs could be done remotely, businesses were not prepared to make this transition back in March 2020. This translated to an unemployment rate of 13.7%, an all-time high since December 1982. While it is important to be aware of our unemployment rate, this rate does not paint a full picture of the labor market. With businesses having to reduce their capacity to comply with health requirements, a lot of people had their hours reduced. And while they were not part of the unemployment rate group, they were also impacted by the pandemic. So we have industries that were mostly impacted by the pandemic, and it was the accommodations and food service, arts, entertainment and recreation, and retail trade. It's important to notice that these industries have a higher concentration of low and minimum wage workers than other sectors. So this means that if they don't work X amount of hours, they won't be able to afford their monthly expenses. So in order to help Canadians during the pandemic, the federal government created programs such as the wage subsidy to help small businesses and the CERB to help individuals who had lost their jobs due to COVID. The payment of $2,000 a month increased the conversation of whether Canada should or not implement a basic income. So prior to the pandemic, social assistance programs had many gaps and they excluded many groups. With the pandemic, these gaps became even more exposed. If we return to the same policies that we had prior to COVID, we're going to be missing an opportunity to reduce poverty. So basic income can mean different things. Today, we won't be going over the specifics and pros and cons of all of the options that we presented on the report, but we are going to explain why we have a case for basic income. So Statistics Canada measures low income and poverty with different sets of data. We have the low income cutoff, LICO, market basket measure, MBM, and the low income measure, LIM. We believe that the most appropriate measure to set a basic income is the MBM. Since 2018, the MBM was adopted as the official method of calculating poverty in Canada. But the most important feature is that it provides geographic measures. In a country as big as ours, we need to take into consideration that the costing for basic needs aren't the same throughout the provinces and territories, and a basic income and social assistance should reflect this. So according to the MBM rates, the national poverty rate decreased from 15.6% in 2006 to 8.7% in 2018, which is an all-time low since the measures was adopted. From the groups in the need for social assistance, we have families with young children, seniors, and working age adults without children. That's from 18 to 64 years old. So I wanted to bring to your attention in the graph in the slideshow. So in the blue line, it represents the poverty rate in overall, so with all of the groups. And we can see that we had a poverty rate decrease since 2006. However, if we look at groups individually, we can see that the biggest reductions came from seniors and families with young children. So this can be attributed to the fact that these two groups are eligible for Canada Benefit Child, the Canada Child Benefit, and the Guaranteed Income Supplement for seniors. This is just one more proof that policies can help lift people out of poverty. However, there is no program like that for the working age population, even though they represent 75% of people living in poverty. I also want to bring to your attention that a portion of these 75% are working poor people. So this means that even though they have a job working full-time, they can still earn the minimum to reach our poverty line. So as of 2018, 1 out of 12 Canadians, roughly 3.2 million Canadians, live in poverty. People who are living in poverty are more likely to face health-related problems, to get involved in the criminal justice system, and they are more likely to need extra social support and assistance. If we have no change in our policies and we just return to the same ones that we had prior to COVID, we will continue to leave millions of Canadians in poverty. Just having programs available for 25% of those who are in need is not enough. We need policies that will help everyone who is in need. And that's why we need a basic income. If Canada addressed poverty efficiently, We're going to promote economic growth, enhance productivity, and improve the quality of life for its citizens. So now I'm just going to pass to my colleague, Rebecca, and she will go over the issues that were further exposed by COVID.
Thank you, Juliana. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I position my interest in the topic of basic income by beginning with these questions from Doreen Massey. What is an economy for? What do we want it to provide? By asking these questions, I hope to set the stage to denaturalize some of the common sense ideas about work, labor, income, and the economy. I seek to historicize and politicize the current epoch of capitalism by naming it for what it is, neoliberalism, an era of capitalism that is no more natural than any other prior era and is in fact the result of state decision-making. In this pandemic, we are facing the consequences of decades of decision-making by the state that has minimized public spending on the populace and prioritized regulatory and tax benefits to the private business sector under the guise that the riches would trickle down. Instead, under neoliberalism, inequality has markedly escalated. Jobs have been outsourced overseas to the lowest bidder, and wages have been stagnant for many years. Jobs have become increasingly precarious with an on-time delivery mentality that often means workers are on call with no dependable income, no benefits, and limited options for refusing a day's work when sick. A gig or entrepreneurial climate has become the norm in certain sectors and is esteemed in our society rather than being critiqued as a downloading of risk onto individual citizens. Technology and neoliberalism have encouraged automation, and the advent of artificial intelligence will only further disrupt the need for human labor in certain sectors. Many Canadians have been surviving on a patchwork of shrinking government assistance, private philanthropy, costly debt, multiple low-paying part-time jobs, and going without. For too long, too many people have barely made enough income to survive, let alone save months of wages for an emergency. We need to imagine a different way. COVID-19 clearly demonstrates that Canada does not have a strong or efficient social safety net in place to support its citizens in a widespread and prolonged time of crisis, and the previous gaps have become chasms. Devastating levels of poverty would have spiked without unprecedented government intervention, so we know the state can enact its power to mobilize funds when it chooses to do so in order to mitigate economic collapse, and they can do so quickly. The societal inequities that existed prior to COVID have become even more apparent as many groups of workers in society that lost their jobs or experienced a significant reduction in hours were not eligible for either employment insurance or the newly created CERB or the student equivalent of CERB. It is this group of workers who were laboring for income, consuming and paying taxes when the economic shutdown occurred that I want to highlight. At this point, there is no quick return to employment for all those who desire or need it. And with the technological and neoliberal trends that were occurring pre-COVID, along with business bankruptcies during COVID, telling people to find a job or go back to work is simply not a realistic answer. There are more workers than jobs. Juliana, thank you. Students and seasonal workers rely on summer employment, often in summer camps and on golf courses, as caregivers for children whose parents are still working, or within the local tourism, all of which were disrupted by COVID. According to Statistics Canada data from August, employment in tourism-related industries and its 27 sub-industries is far from its pre-pandemic level and is still down 29% compared to February 2020. The Canada Emergency Student Benefit was created when it became evident that most students did not qualify for either EI or CERB. However, this was limited to the end of summer, is taxable, and was paid out at a significantly lower rate than the CERB. Although the economy is beginning to reopen, A labor force survey from July 2020 notes that most job gains occurred in part-time positions, in jobs that are usually paid minimum wage with few, if any, benefits. And these jobs are again at risk of being shut down as wave 2 of the pandemic takes force. The return of jobs only began in Ontario in June, meaning that many students and seasonal workers had lost half a season of employable time and income. And as of July, these part-time jobs were still 5% lower than the pre-COVID levels, rather than experiencing any seasonal growth. An update from the October labor force survey indicates the recent growth in jobs in Canada has been in full-time positions, but this growth is uneven geographically and across industries. And while positive as a whole, few students can take on full-time employment. In 2018, 2.9 million Canadians were self-employed, which accounts for 15% of total employment in Canada. Neoliberalism encourages entrepreneurial activities. These workers are generally painted as having the freedom to suit their job to their lifestyle. However, we can critique this positioning of the neoliberal candidate as they use their own funds to undertake economic risk by starting their own company and creating their own job. They pay taxes, they create gross domestic product growth, possibly hire others, and yet they are entitled to almost nothing from the government in return. Those who were self-employed when COVID began did not qualify for CERB, nor were they likely to have qualified for EI. Approximately 1.7 million Canadians worked in the gig economy prior to the pandemic, and many of these workers are found in the cultural industries and its supporting industries. When businesses shut down and people were sent home, many of these often self-employed and gig workers were ineligible for EI, meaning, and they had no way of translating their craft into an online form to create income. GDP by industry from March 2020 indicates that the arts, entertainment, and recreation sector fell by 41% in the early months of COVID. An August 2020 update from Stats Canada suggests that payroll employment in this industry is farther away from its pre-COVID levels than any other sector. Seasonal workers from the Caribbean and Latin America are necessary to fill gaps our aging and static society cannot, and at wages most Canadians would not accept. And our food production chain relies on this cheap and not completely legitimized source of labor. Farmers warned the government that these temporary foreign workers were the backbone of this country's agricultural industry, and up to 95% of crops would be threatened without this workforce in a national shutdown. In response, as Canada shut its borders to travelers, it made an exception for 60,000 seasonal agriculture workers deemed critical to the survival of the industry. Migrant workers are often not considered full citizens in the public sphere as they do not pay taxes, and a bulk of their money is sent to their relatives in their country of origin. This lack of citizenry is evident in their lack of rights under the Temporary Foreign Workers Program, where these workers are not entitled to minimum wage, overtime pay, or a day off, and many of them also don't have basic healthcare coverage. These workers are vulnerable in additional ways, given the federal oversight of their housing conditions has been notoriously inadequate, which has led to COVID outbreaks on farms in Ontario. Workers were afraid to tell their employer they were sick for fear of being sent home, and socially distancing oneself was simply not an option on many farms. Yet, we need these workers to feed our society. The COVID-19 pandemic has put many workers in Canada into an even more precarious position than they were before. It has been seriously economically detrimental to 53% of Canada's population that depends on each upcoming paycheck to make ends meet. There is another group of workers not discussed here, several in fact, those already on EI when the pandemic struck, who would not have been eligible for CERB nor an extension of EI benefits, as those were only enacted in September 2020. Manual laborers and the working poor have had fewer options to stay home and receive income, and thus faced higher risks of infection. Generally, lower income, hourly paid workers have faced far worse healthcare risks and outcomes during the pandemic. COVID-19 has further impacted marginalized and racialized communities that tend to be more heavily distributed into lower income brackets. For comparison, pre-COVID-19 poverty measures based on 2016 census data show a poverty rate of 9.6% among Caucasians, but for racialized groups, these poverty rates ranged from 20 to 32%. As a result, the impacts of COVID-19 have disproportionately affected racialized groups from both an economic and healthcare perspective. While the CERB assisted over 8.34 million people who had lost their jobs or had their hours decreased due to government-enforced shutdowns, the CERB has now ended, and the new EI program that replaces it is also temporary. These are ineffective long-term responses. The new program, the Canada Recovery Benefit, is effective from September 27th, 2020 for 1 year and would provide a benefit amount of $400 per week for up to 26 weeks. This new benefit is available to workers who were not previously eligible for EI, mainly the self-employed and those working in the gig economy, and is expected to help approximately 1.8 million Canadians. But as we see across Canada, as the cases are spiking again in wave 2, this pandemic is far from finished, wreaking its havoc. So, returning to Doreen Massey's question, I argue that the point of an economy is to care for the people who create and sustain that economy through their labor and or their consumption. Our current system has failed to care for over half of the working population. As I end, I want to leave you with this thought from my colleague Hugh, who in the early days of talking about our work on basic income referred to people as infrastructure, as a different route, economic route to recovery. Thank you for your time. Hugh?
Thank you, Rebecca. Colleagues, as Rebecca mentioned, the infections that were caused by the virus, serious illness, and economic hardship fell disproportionately on the 3.2 million Canadians who are living beneath the poverty line, within whom people who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color are wildly overrepresented. Low-paid hourly employees without benefits like sick leave or the freedom to work from home had much higher infection and death rates than those who were better off. If we think of our long-term care homes, many of the employees in those care homes at the outset of the pandemic and for many years before were part-time, working poor, no sick leave, no benefits, who had no choice but to work in more than one facility so as to have any hope of making ends meet. They ended up becoming innocent vectors of the virus from home to home, which is how we can understand that when we don't have basic support to allow low-income people to live with some measure of dignity, we actually create huge and massive costs for society as a whole. The fact that the federal government introduced new programs like CERB and others indicated that they understood that EI was inadequate. They understood that provincial welfare was inadequate to meet the requirements for liquidity that were being generated by the shutdowns that were based on public health advice. It makes it perfectly clear that going back to the old normal without addressing the core issue of poverty is simply an irrational public policy response. It's also very, very clear that when we go forward as a society and provide huge amounts of liquidity, as is appropriate, for large financial institutions, for the financial markets, as we did when COVID came upon us, and as happened in 08, 09 with the credit crunch in the United States, we really have to think about how we provide liquidity for the low-income parts of the economy who also need support during that period of time and generically. Juliana, you can go to the next slide. There have been three options broadly discussed about basic income, and people of good faith and reasonable people can disagree on which makes the most sense. The Ontario pilot project was based on lifting people from essentially $700 a month, which is what you get on welfare in Ontario as a single recipient, to about $1,400 a month, which is to double that amount, which would be done automatically via a CRA top-up. And that would roughly take people to 75% of the market basket measure. But unlike welfare, it would encourage people to work. As people listening will know, our welfare programs across Canada do not pay in any province more than half of the MBM in that province, the market basket measure. And the regulations around welfare programs largely say that if someone who can't get by in downtown, let us say Toronto, on $700 a month, tries to make some income from other sources, if they earn more than a couple of $100, that will be clawed back by Ontario Works dollar for dollar, which means we have a working income tax rate for poor people of 100%, something which is not imposed on the wealthiest Canadians at the highest end of their marginal income. The other proposal was the Basic Income Canada Network proposal, which was to take the CERB number of $2,000 monthly and provide that as the basic income, again, through the tax system. And that would have a gross cost of $134 billion, which would require some program replacement and increased taxation rates. And the most favored option for people on the far left and for many in the public service is a multi-aspect process of filling the gaps in the current system of social supports, rather than actually giving cash to low-income people so they can spend the money as they would decide is appropriate in their own circumstance. And that really reflects the notion that, which you often find from well-intentioned people, that you cannot trust low-income people to spend money honorably or honestly or effectively. And that, of course, speaks to the worst kind of discrimination, the discrimination of low expectations. And in all the studies that have been done, recently a study as recently as a couple of months ago in British Columbia, where homeless people were given $7,500, they actually all spent the money in exactly the way you and I would spend the money, finding a better place to live, getting a spot where they don't have to couch surf or live rough on the street. Their decisions were free, but also completely rational. And there's no reason to believe that low-income Canadians, given that top-up, would not act in a similar way. The other thing, of course, about option 3 is that it implies that if the swells, those who work in government, those who are in the caring organizations, a bit of the poverty industry, shape programs that they think are good for low-income people, then low-income people will accommodate themselves to those programs. And Evelyn Forget, who did the landmark study on the Dauphin basic income pilot, said in her discussions with the people who worked on the Missing Indigenous and Murdered Women Commission, that designing programs that way is actually colonialism. And we should ask our friends in Indian Affairs and Northern Development how that has worked over the last many decades. Next slide. So here are the folks who normally fall into the people who are opposed to these kinds of measures. Number one would be the folks who care about spending discretion. They're largely public servants and or lobbyists who lobby the federal government for programs that they want for their industries, which is completely legitimate and appropriate, or tax cuts as the case may be. And they argue that if you have another statutory cash transfer program, that will limit the discretion of civil servants, ministers, and governments to spend money on other things. That is usually a discussion which does not embrace what the benefits of dealing with poverty would be relative to reducing other costs in the system. Second group are the people who argue, and they're often on the far right, but not only, to be fair, that basic income, if you give money to people who aren't working, why would they actually ever work? And you need, of course, to have incentives to work for the economic model to be constructive. Well, remember, low-income people fall into two categories: the welfare poor and the working poor. There's a whole bunch of people, as Juliana said in her presentation, who work very hard, have 1 or 2 full-time jobs, but don't earn enough to get above the poverty line in that process. So the notion that topping them up and letting them know there's a bit of a backstop in the event they get into difficulty, or they might have enough money to decide to not work in a low-paying, lousy job with no benefits, but maybe improve their education or look for a better job, would discourage their will to work. There's simply no evidence of that. And there's been no evidence in all the pilots that have been done in Dauphin, Manitoba, in Stockton, California, in the Netherlands, in Finland, in Kenya, that people who are given this top up, this particular protection, don't show up to work. Quite the contrary. The level of engagement with the workforce remains consistent through the process. And the final argument is the affordability argument. And you will hear this not only from folks on the right who are often in favor of austerity as the response to all problems, but also people who are genuinely concerned about the balance between spending and income for any government. That affordability argument does not reflect 2 factors. One, if we brought in a basic income done by the federal government, as in the same way as the guaranteed income supplement now operates. So we have a mechanism in place. It's tied to CRA, it's effective and it's efficient. That would, by definition, produce a bunch of welfare programs which are no longer necessary because the people receiving welfare would have from the federal government a high enough threshold not to be eligible for welfare anymore. That would save the provinces $30 billion a year. And folks will remember that the provinces a few weeks ago asked the federal government for $28 billion a year to reinforce their health costs and other legitimate concerns they're addressing. And we also have to be careful that the affordability argument only looks at one side of the ledger. It looks at the gross cost, what that would look like. It doesn't look at the benefits over time that would accrue to other aspects of the system, of the infrastructure. So for example, we know from the work done in Dauphin, Manitoba, that people who got the automatic top-up had 8.5% lower usage of the Manitoba health insurance system than was the case prior to the top-up. We know that there were less arrests. We know that there were less car accidents. A whole bunch of issues tied directly to the stress and the panic, often associated with living on a low income, were addressed constructively in ways that would be very helpful to our system overall. So I'm going to leave it there, colleagues, and I look forward to any questions that you may have for any of us who had the privilege of working together on this together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to each of you for the presentation. For those of you online, there's a couple ways that you can ask questions. So there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And if you click on that, it will bring up a box. You can type in questions. There's also a chat function and you can post questions into the chat. And we do have a question from Douglas in the chat, which is really a kind of point of clarification. In Juliana's chart on poverty, does the data include First Nation communities, Indigenous communities? Juliana, can you comment on that?
Yes, so Statistics Canada didn't report poverty on minority groups and racialized groups. So they just started doing that like a couple months ago. And the most recent data that we have is from 2018. So that graph does not include Indigenous people.
Okay.
But Warren, let me just add to Juliana's response that the poverty rates amongst First Nations in Canada are roughly run in the 30% range, which is roughly equivalent to third world poverty rates. So they are not reflected in the chart. And those folks who have made proposals in terms of basic income programs, certainly in Ontario and elsewhere, were of the view that one would have to work within the context of reconciliation and respect for sovereignty with First Nations leadership to decide how that might operate. The urban areas are not problematic because there are many First Nations people who live in the urban areas and who would participate as was the case in the Ontario pilot, as anybody else. But for those who are living on First Nation communities, you'd have to design a program collaboratively with the First Nations leadership, tribal councils, and the rest to make sure that it was done in a way respectful of their sovereignty and reflective of the spirit and principle of reconciliation.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you. This is a really good part of the discussion, or important part of the discussion. So thanks to Douglas for raising that in the chat. I'm going to go into our Q&A, and the first question comes from Maria. It's interesting that we discuss marginalized groups and acknowledge the challenges of those groups. She's interested in how the universities might allow equal opportunities for students who can't afford to better themselves. She goes on to say that it's irrational to expect $50,000 plus in debt, and yet the schools don't seem to be moving forward fast enough. Now, I'll throw it out to our three panelists to see if you have any comments or suggestions on this point. I'm not expecting you to solve it, but it certainly is an issue to talk about. Anybody want to jump in?
Well, I'll just offer one view. There have been a series of universities, both in the United Kingdom and in the United States, which have decided to provide for people from disadvantaged groups free tuition. But of course, the issue of fair access is more complex than that, because the issue of poverty, as it grinds away at people's economic and intellectual opportunities over their lives, will affect those who get through high school and who can do the admission exams and can make it into universities with high standards for admission. So it's a more complex issue than just what the universities have to do. But I think it does relate to the ability of financial support for low-income families to increase the opportunities for betterment and advancement for every member of the family, including those who would aspire to go to university. And that's where a basic income, I think, could be helpful, and universities could, within the context of their challenges around affordability these days, decide how they want to participate in that from their perspective, beyond the range of bursaries and loans which are offered by many universities, and in many cases supported by OSAP and other programs from the provinces.
That's great. Thank you so much, Hugh. Any other comments, Rebecca or Juliana? Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to reinforce that a couple of years ago, I was in college and we had like the Ontario government, they started like the OSAP. And one of the things that they had was like free tuition. That was like I think it was like great support for students, because I was going to school and I was like more relaxed, like, oh, I can focus on my studies and I don't have to work on top of that. And I don't necessarily have to like be thinking about how much debt I'm gonna have once I graduate. So I think that was it was a great thing, but like they pushed back.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Juliana. It's nice to hear that commentary from somebody who's gone through it. Next question comes from Elaine Power. So there's so much evidence of the benefits of basic income. It's a no-brainer. But how do we move this on to the political agenda? There seems to be no political capital in addressing poverty. Do we need a Tommy Douglas champion? Thank you for your work. Any thoughts from our panel?
Well, let me say this to Elaine, and I know that Elaine has been doing so much work on food insecurity, which is one of the critical issues which affect many parts of our society, and has also been a leader in terms of advocacy and promotion for basic income. I would say that if you go back to the Tommy Douglas example, there was a confluence of events. There was a fight in Saskatchewan, which he won, to bring in universal health insurance. It wasn't an easy fight, it was uphill. And then when that was brought in, a conservative prime minister, Tommy having been a CCF, New Democrat, a conservative prime minister went to Mr. Justice Hall, retired of the Supreme Court, to do a study on what it meant for Canada. And that was Prime Minister Diefenbaker, who also came from Saskatchewan. Mr. Hall did that report. He ended up handing it to Mike Pearson because Mr. Diefenbaker had already been defeated in the 1963 general election. And Mike Pearson took the report, and then, even though he never had a majority government, he was in a minority circumstance between 63 and 68. He found a way, working with the provinces, providing some dollar for dollar backstop for capital spending in case hospitals had to be built to deal with the increased demand that universal health insurance would generate. But he was able to put together a plan through what I would call cooperative federalism to put it in place right across Canada universally. And the plan was structured so that even premiers who weren't in favor of it, like Premier Robarts then of Ontario, couldn't turn his back on the dollar for dollar funding for the expansion of healthcare because the baby boom reality was very, very demanding. So there's a way to do it. And I look at the fact that we have a minority parliament now with the NDP having a fair amount of influence, the Green Party, who's been in favor of basic income for over a decade, and even the Conservatives, who now have a working group of 3 caucus members working on what a basic income might look like as part of an overall economic recovery plan to which their caucus is giving some consideration. So there is opportunity there, and we have a new Minister of Finance who brings a great level of integrity and worldliness, and she did write a book called The Plutocrats about the gap between the wealthiest and the poorest, so she's not someone insensitive to the issue. So I think a lot of work, and there are MPs. There's Elena Kazan, who's a member of parliament from Winnipeg, who has a motion before the House of Commons. The NDP brought in a motion before the House of Commons. There have been several motions in the Senate, and there's been quite a bit of debate there. So I think we're beginning to see a critical mass of ways ahead coming together. Now, whether those critical mass ideas actually get taken up remains to be seen, but I'm more hopeful now than I've been for some many decades.
That's great. Thank you, Hugh. And I think that this answer really goes a long way to answering the next question in our queue, which is that the evidence is so overwhelmingly positive for a universal basic income. Why are governments so resistant to the policy? So I don't know if you have anything to add there. It's kind of on the other side of the equation. I think you've answered it fairly thoroughly. So let's go to Hillary's question, which builds on this. So she says, thank you very much for the presentation. There's a lot of evidence out there that supports big projects, but the successes are found largely in small scale pilots. So how do we scale it up? Anybody want to take a stab at that one?
I'm going to leave that for Hugh.
Well, let me just say this. One province of Prince Edward Island, has been working. They have a Green official opposition. They have a red Tory government. Dennis King is the premier. They've been working through a legislative committee to do a province-wide pilot, so that would scale it up. PEI has about 167,000 people, about 22,000 live beneath the poverty line. So it's manageable. And they have made it perfectly clear that they would like to do this. They need a little bit of help from the feds. And I don't think Canada would be troubled by PEI deciding to step forward and do a test in that respect. A similar resolution was passed in Newfoundland under the new premier, and that is now being addressed by the legislature, by the assembly in Newfoundland. So we are beginning to see scale up efforts. A strong view amongst those of us who've had the privilege of being involved in pilots that were beyond the stage of pilots. It's now time for policy implementation. If we look at CERB, there was no pilot by which we tested CERB. It was a design from the Department of Finance, to their credit. I know people worked day and night to come up with it, to deal with a serious shortfall in liquidity for people who lost their jobs through no fault of their own. So we can do this. This is not something which is rocket science. And we just need the political will and the pressure from different parts of the economy. And I note, by the way, that the Canadian Manufacturers Association and the Conference Board have come out on side of doing something on basic income. So this is not something which is limited just to academics or just to folks who work with those who live beneath the poverty line, or just to those who might be on the left. It's a broader mix about efficiency and productivity. And I think the will to take it forward is now very much in front of us.
Thank you, Hugh. Any other comments, Rebecca or Juliana? So this response has really gotten to the heart of what Hannah has asked, and I'll read out her question just in case. She's interested in the perspective as particularly Mr. Segal's perspective as somebody who's identified as a conservative. How do you prevent the issue from being dismissed as a leftist idea? Now, I think we've actually had a pretty good discussion there that has talked about how the idea has gone beyond simply being an idea on the left. And, you know, Hugh's done a good job of laying out how different groups are starting to address it. Anything to add there, Hugh, or do you think?
Well, only that to say that it's an idea that comes from the left is to be profoundly ahistorical about where it came from. The first North American leader to try it was that terrible Marxist by the name of Richard Milhouse Nixon, president of the United States. And he had gotten elected on a law and order proposition in '68. And when his White House staff began to look at the law and order issue in urban United States, they realized that it was tied unmistakably to poverty. And that's why they shaped a program that was called the Family Benefits Program, which would do away with the difficulty which people who lived in poverty faced in the US, that if the husband and the father were, husband and the mother were living in the home, they wouldn't qualify because the presumption was they could earn enough to get by. So a lot of fathers left so that the mother and children could actually get some support from local welfare programs. Nixon, being a Republican and a centrist conservative, said that we can't be encouraging the breakup of families. So they brought in the Family Benefits Program. And Patrick Moynihan wrote a wonderful book on why it did not pass the US Congress, because the right-wing people thought it was too generous and the left-wing people didn't think it was generous enough, and it died. But that's where it started. And then that was taken up by Bob Stanfield, who was the progressive conservative leader at a policy conference in 1969 and advanced it. And let's remember that devil of right-wing monetary economics, who the left hates, Milton Friedman, said around that time in the 60s, that if you gave the American government control of the Sahara Desert, we'd have sand shortages in 3 years. Don't give the money to bureaucrats and program designers. Give the money to people who need it. They will know how to spend it. They will spend it properly. They will spend it in their own community. They will not spend it on tax dodge accounts in the Caymans. They will integrate it, and that will make the community better, and that will work efficiently. So there's a lot of legitimate middle C and small c conservative roots that are just as prominent in this as are our friends on the left.
Great. Thanks, Hugh. I want to get to, there's a couple of related questions here. So Ross mentions that there's been movement towards UBI incomes in recent years, but there's been consistent resistance to the idea in some political circles. What do we need to do differently in terms of communication, implementation, consultation to bring people on side and to decrease the opposition? And there's a related question from Duncan Sinclair. So Duncan asks, what are the real reasons why trials of guaranteed basic income have been aborted? So I think the two things get at the same issue. How do we address the resistance, and how do we address the move in certain circles to shut these things down?
So I actually think that poverty should be addressed as poverty, not as a political ideology. Many of you might not know, but I have more right ideologies than left. And I think, like, when we're talking about basic income, I try to not think about my political ideologies and actually the data that we have. We have people under poverty, and that's bad for the economy and for the country, just like how you value and the quality of life for your citizens. So I feel like when political parties realize that you just have to ignore that and focus on what is best for the people, that's like democracy is all about, right? Like, you have to do for the people. So impoverished should be solved like that. So I feel like we have to leave the political ideologies aside and try to think about how can we reduce poverty overall.
Rebecca, did you want to add something?
I did. Yes, I'm unmuted. Okay, good. So from my sort of cultural critique perspective, the author that I was quoting, Doreen Massey, that work from 2015, what she is arguing for is that the very language that we use when we talk about matters of the economy sort of obfuscate issues of power. And they set up, because language is so important, they set up this bias that we can only talk in certain ways. We're very sort of trapped in how we can have these discussions. And so that's what she's challenging in that work. And for me, in terms of getting people on side with this and breaking through some resistance, you know, what I see needs to happen is we do need to sort of challenge the language that's used, because I think that the instant reaction that people have is they feel threatened. We're such an individualistic society. We're not collective. And so not me, I can't afford any more taxes, right? I'm strapped. And there, just in the last day or two, there's been a small sample survey that's come out that shows, in terms of the NDP has put forward a motion to put a 1% tax on people who hold more than $20 million in assets, I believe it is. So it's a wealth tax. There's overwhelming support in Canada, according to this survey, and it's across the spectrum. It's across the political spectrum. So the numbers might be a little bit lower in for conservative support, but the support is still there. However, and I could be wrong, so jump in and correct me, I think it actually was voted down, which is really disappointing. So that would be my perspective, is like, we really have to get the public talking, which is why I was privileged and felt grateful to have this opportunity to talk to the public about the issues of language when we talk about the economy.
Thank you, Rebecca. You, anything to add on that?
Well, you know, only to say this, the programs the pilots were stopped. In the case of the Manitoba Dauphin pilot, Sterling Lyon defeated Ed Schreier, who was the premier who had made the agreement with Pierre Trudeau to do the pilot. And at the same time, roughly, Mr. Trudeau was defeated by Joe Clark. And classically, political parties of a different affiliation don't like to follow through on the ideas that are begun by people of different political affiliations. That was one of the issues. The other issue was that Pierre Trudeau had gone to a G7 meeting in Munich where there was a decision about austerity and dealing with inflationary pressures. So that reduced some federal expenditure capacity, and that also contributed to the end. So I don't think that was a particularly willful or nasty event. The Ontario pilot was stopped for a really substantially different reason. During the election campaign, Laurie Muspratten of the Star had asked all three parties where they were on the continuation of the pilot after the election. But the NDP made it perfectly clear that while they were cynical about the government of Ontario's perspectives on the issue, they would wait for the numbers to come in after the pilot was over and decide on evidence. Patrick Brown, when he was leader of the Progressive Conservatives, had said the same thing. When Mr. Ford became leader, so the question went to his campaign bus. And I think it was Ms. Laspin, who was his spokesperson, who said on two separate occasions in writing that they like the pilot and they want to see the results before they come to a decision. So that's where things were. And those decisions were important because they encouraged lots of people to sign up from low-income groups to be part of the pilot, the 4,000 who were in the three communities. And then when the government came in, they had made a series of interesting commitments about buck a beer and freezing hydro and a whole bunch of other things, which were actually quite costly. And folks will remember that they overestimated the provincial deficit by only 100%. And so what happens in those circumstances when they do the, oh my God, the cupboard is bare routine, which all new governments do, they went to the cabinet and said, all you departments have to chip in so we can keep our fiscal balance. And as the pilot was going to cost $50 million a year, ComSoc, its officials and others said, well, look, we can put 100 million in because we're going to shut down year 2 and year 3 of the pilot, and we'll be, popular at the table. And I think that's kind of why they made that, in my view, really sad decision, because we'd be sitting now with hard evidence, how it worked, how much it cost, what the benefits were, how they were measured, upon which governments could be making decisions. And sadly, we didn't. So that's why I think the pilots tend to get stopped.
Thank you. So there are actually more questions piling up in our Q&A, but we are coming to the end of our hour. And I think that this is probably as good a place as any to stop. This is a discussion that needs to continue, clearly. And I think that we'll look for ways to extend the conversation through our policy series and through the events that we organize in the school through this year and into the winter semester of 2021, if you can imagine. So I'd like to take a moment to thank all 3 of our panelists, to thank Hugh, Rebecca, and Juliana. This has been a really fantastic conversation and such an important topic, and we're delighted that you'll be able to bring this information to our viewers. I want to thank everybody who's logged in online to take part in this event. We've really appreciated the support of everybody who has come and listened and contributed questions and thoughts in our conversation. This is incredibly helpful. I'll remind everybody that we have another talk coming up next week on November 24th. The title of that talk is Political Litigation Regarding COVID-19. That will be at 4 p.m. and you should have your Zoom details. And the speaker is Gregory Tardy, who is the Executive Director of the Institute of Parliamentary and Political Law. So we're really looking forward to that. Rebecca, you wanted a quick word?
Yeah, I just wanted to give a nod to Elaine Power, who's going to be doing a talk through the Contagion Cultures series. I think it was on our last slide, December 8th, I believe it is. Who's sort of picking up this conversation, I think, a bit and talking about CERB and a way forward. So I wanted to remind our listeners about that.
Thank you, Rebecca. You jumped ahead of me, but that's terrific. So we're in perfect alignment here. So please do come back. Early December 8th, I believe, we have Elaine Power, who will be continuing some of this conversation and introducing some new ideas. So thank you again to all of you. I hope that you've enjoyed this. Look forward to seeing you next week and as we move forward. Have a great afternoon and everybody stay safe. Thank you.